the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on India's strengthening relations with G7 countries. The participants are Skandharanjan Tayal, former ambassador, and Manoj Joshi, strategic analyst. The moderator is Manas Pratimbuya, journalist.
Ambassador Tayal, from its initial focus on economic issues, the G7 has gradually become a forum for consultation to find common ground on major global challenges, including peace and security, counterterrorism, development, education, health, environment, and climate change. How do you see G7 significance in today's geopolitical context?
Today's geopolitical context is very difficult with so many new fault lines emerging globally which have a direct bearing on the global south. So G7, whatever their decisions are, whether on economic issues or geopolitical issues, they have a direct bearing on rest of the world. And that's why this G7 outreach meeting today, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi would be there, as well as many other leaders of non G7 members like Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, Algeria, Kenya, Jordan, etc. It will be a good platform to convey to the leaders of G7, the largest economies of the world, that what are the concerns of the rest of the world, because it seems that the G7 countries, which are mostly like West European or NATO, one can say, Canada, US, Japan is always with them, they seem to be driven by their own concept of the world with their own concerns. And it seems that the concerns of the rest of the world are being marginalized or even ignored. So it is a very important meeting from that point of view, that at least a dialogue would be there and the concerns of the rest of the world or major economies, major countries would be conveyed to G7. Finally, whether they take it on board or not, that the future will tell. But it is a very welcome and good effort for a dialogue between G7, the biggest economies, Western economies, market economies, and some major countries of the world.
Mr. Joshi, India has attended 11 G7 outreach sessions till date, including today's outreach session being attended by Prime Minister Modi. And all the participations from India have been at the level of Prime Minister. Today, India is the world's fifth largest economy. Its economy is larger than three G7 member countries, France, Italy, and Canada. Do you think India's consistent participation reflects its growing global stature?
Actually, India has been invited by G7 for a very long time. In the sense, I remember accompanying Prime Minister Vajpayee back in 2003, where the meeting was in Geneva. So we have been constantly looked at us as a potential world leader. And now, at this time, they have invited presidents of Brazil, Turkey, some other non-Western countries. Basically, it's now become much more important to showcase the shifting global landscape. There are so many issues where the North and the South need to resolve amongst themselves. For example, for G7 countries, migration is a big issue. In Europe itself, there has been a resurgence of right-wing parties on the issue of one of the major issues is migration. The other issue is competition with China, security in the Indo-Pacific region. Then the whole issue of the global south, whole developmental issues of the global south. So there are several issues which are involved, and I think as India's stature in the world grows, definitely I would say that we are headed towards a situation where G7 could one day include us and become G8. So it will not be just outreach, we will be substantive members, but that is still some distance away.
Ambassador Tayal, Prime Minister Modi in his departure statement says India's participation will be an opportunity to bring greater synergy between the outcomes of the G20 summit held under India's presidency in September and the current G7 summit. And it will also provide an opportunity to deliberate on issues which are crucial for global south. So how do you see PM's observation and articulation of India's participation at the G7 outreach summit?
First, I would say that India is already the fifth largest economy in the world, and perhaps within 5 years, India could well be the third largest economy of the world. So we ought to be in any large group of democratic countries which are the largest economies. Now, of course, India has emerged as a very strong and principled spokes country for the global south. The entire effort in the G20 last year New Delhi summit was in that direction. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, perhaps the focus, because basically it is an economic summit, G7 is basically has a economic agenda. Focus would be on artificial intelligence, energy, Africa, and Mediterranean. Now, there is another point which has been added by the EU side, and that is migration. India's effort is to project it as mobility, not by illegal migration of any kind. But India has been advocating, projecting, promoting that there should be rules, procedures, and transparent rules for mobility of professionals, skilled workers, unskilled workers. But the biggest worry, perhaps, where all the major countries must come together is the future of artificial intelligence. Because an unregulated artificial intelligence and the generative artificial intelligence can spell absolute disaster for developing countries which have large population like India, because many of the jobs which we call now skilled jobs in computer programming and all kinds of things, it could just disappear. So this is an area where very much regulation is required, and also, of course, that there is a real danger. And just like in the world, human cloning, the world has come together that genetic engineering will be allowed, but human cloning will not be allowed. I think there is need for all important countries to come together as far as the future direction, role, destination of artificial intelligence is concerned.
Mr. Joshi, a key focus of Italian presidency of G7 has been to defend the rules-based international system. Italy says Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine has undermined its principles and triggered growing instability around the world. With multiple crises unfolding worldwide, the G7 has primarily been focusing in this summit also on the Ukraine conflict. Do you think the G7 must deliberate on similar challenges in other parts of the world, including in Asia?
Well, the G7, by its very nature and very fact of its outreach, is virtually involved in global issues. Whereas the Italian focus right now is basically to showcase the new government, Prime Minister Meloni's government. She has visited India twice last year to consolidate India-Italy strategic partnership, because one thing is the G7 itself. The second part of it is the bilateral meetings that are taking place. And I think it's very important bilateral meeting Prime Minister has had with Prime Minister Macron and President Zelensky, and will hold a meeting with the Pope and Prime Minister Meloni as well. So the point I'm trying to make is that the scope of issues that the G7 will discuss are global. And while there are conflicts and crises like what is happening in Ukraine or what is happening in West Asia, something which they will look at, there is also, they look beyond that to see how there can be better partnership, how we can jointly resolve some of the world's very pressing issues. As Mr. Tayal pointed out, future issues like artificial intelligence. And one of the important decisions that the G7 has already taken is on using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. So this is a very important development, and I'm sure the Russians will react somehow or the other to this. But as I said, this is a combination. This is a combination of global issues, regional issues, and also bilateral. And Prime Minister Modi himself has said that he remembered his first visit to Italy for the G20 summit in 2021, and then Prime Minister Meloni's visit to India. So he remembers them fondly, and so very important element of this is to promote the Indian relationship with Italy, the host. Italy is India's fourth largest trading partner in the EU, with a bilateral trade worth 15 billion. And I think we can do much more on this front.
Mr. Joshi, my point was that, in fact, I mean, G7, the last two summits, we have seen focus extensively on the Ukraine conflict, but the world is facing various other challenges also. The challenges being faced by the global south, the challenges of lack of infrastructure, how to deal with the challenges of climate change. Asia is facing different challenges, including from an aggressive China. India is facing similar challenges in Indian Ocean region. The West Asia is also staring at a major crisis as the hostilities in Gaza continues. My point is that excessive focus on only Ukraine conflict will the relevance of G7 diminish, in fact, in the long run.
Not really. See, what I said is that that's why I said the G7 grouping itself. This is the grouping of rich nations, and it is G7. And don't forget that we are the outreach nations. So they are basically trying to develop an outreach towards us. So the G7 in itself has taken the decision with regard to Ukraine. In that, we are not involved in that sense. But yes, of course, Prime Minister has had a bilateral meeting with President Zelensky. So I think it's important to separate the G7 proceedings, which they will have amongst themselves, and the proceedings that they will have with the outreach nations. And as I said, the third tier, which is bilateral meetings of our Prime Minister with various other top leaders, which is equally important. This opportunity is an equally important one, as we obviously do not participate in the G7 proceedings. So when it comes to the other issues, in the outreach issues and in the bilateral format, definitely all those issues come up.
Ambassador Tayal, Prime Minister Modi, in his statement before leaving for Italy, said India will focus on artificial intelligence, as you also mentioned, on energy, Africa, and the Mediterranean. What's the significance of deliberations on these areas, including artificial intelligence, energy, and Africa, in the current geopolitical context, in the context of current geopolitical power play, as well as great power competition that we are witnessing?
I think first, all your listeners must appreciate that President Biden is faced with survival, in the sense that all reports say that President Trump may win. Rishi Sunak is in trouble. All reports in England say that perhaps Labour Party will come back. Emmanuel Macron, President of France, has been weakened by the recent EU elections. So G7 leaders are very preoccupied with their own electorate, with their own issues, and there they will pay perhaps lip service to Africa. The people of West Europe, people of US, the masses, the population is not concerned about climate change. They are more concerned about jobs, about migration, and inflation. So, yes, Prime Minister Modi has gone with a very ambitious agenda. He will absolutely, in all bilateral meetings, in his statement, will push that agenda. But in my assessment, we should not expect much from this G7 summit, because the major countries, which are really France, Germany, UK, and US, they are in some kind of a democratic transition or challenges to their leaders. They are not as strong as Prime Minister Modi is. So, but yes, the global south must keep on articulating their concerns, must keep agenda on those concerns. But for G7, their primary focus is still on Ukraine. They are not listening at all to global south, and the way they have frozen the Russian assets of 200, $300 billion, when most of the countries keep their foreign exchange, their gold in Western banks, in Western institutions. Like that, a country's assets cannot be frozen and their interest cannot be diverted. So tomorrow, if any country falls foul of US, you think his assets in the Western countries should be frozen. So there are some very serious issues involved here. But G7, unfortunately, is totally oblivious to the concern of the rest of the world, unfortunately, I feel.
Mr. Joshi, we have seen, in fact, the BRICS has emerged as a very, very important grouping, particularly for the global south. BRICS is expanding at a rapid pace. We have G20, we have G7, and in all these three kind of major groupings, India has been playing a key role in BRICS. India is a major player in G20, and India has been an important contributor to overall outcomes of G7 summits as well. So, do you think it reflects India's growing global stature? Because for each and every important groupings or bloc, India is now kind of indispensable a member.
There is no doubt that India is today has pretty high prestige in the global scheme of things. Not only that, I think we have our diplomacy, if you see, spoken of BRICS. So in BRICS, we are there with China and Russia. Then we are there in the Indo-Pacific in the Quad. Right now, we are participating in the outreach of the G7. G20, we have last year presided over it. So India is now in a situation where India is playing the role of what the External Affairs Minister Sir Jaishankar says is the leading power, play a greater role for the Global South. And we often say that our mission in the Global South act as a bridge between the G7 and the Global South. And you can only be a bridge if you have credibility on both ends of the bridge. And I think we have that credibility, not only between the Global South and the G7, but also, let us say, Russia and the G7. For example, if you need an interlocutor, whether it is on the Russia-Ukraine thing or whether you need it in the Palestine-Israel thing, India has taken positions where India plays a very balanced role. And I think India is extremely well positioned to take the initiative to try to promote peace and global development through all these policies.
Mr. Tayal, as we are discussing Ukraine also, it's a very big challenge for the globe. Prime Minister Modi today met President Zelensky of Ukraine and conveyed to him that India would continue to do everything possible within its means to support a peaceful solution to the Ukraine conflict, and asserted that the way to peace is through dialogue and diplomacy. How do you see Prime Minister's message to President Zelensky?
India's message and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's message from day one of Ukraine-Russia conflict has been loud and clear that the conflict should be resolved by dialogue and diplomacy. We all recall Prime Minister Modi's advice to President Putin in Indonesia that these are not the days of war. So his advice certainly to President Zelensky would have been to try to finish the war and not prolong the war, because the preconditions which Ukraine has suggested for any negotiations that Russia should withdraw, that is not likely to happen. And the second point where there would have been a discussion that this is meeting in Switzerland, the summit where Ukraine will be discussed, but Russia has not been invited. India has not yet made it clear whether India will participate or not. China perhaps has conveyed that they will not participate. So President Zelensky would have tried to convince Prime Minister Modi to participate in the Geneva summit on Ukraine. My own assessment is that India may participate at some level, but I do not really feel that Prime Minister Modi himself would participate.
But how do you specifically see Prime Minister Modi's comments that India would do everything within its means to support a peaceful solution to the Ukraine conflict?
Whenever the time comes for a dialogue, then India will be in a very central position, because India, Prime Minister Modi, our External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar, they can any day call on telephone the President and Foreign Minister of Russia or Ukraine or any other party involved. So they have a certain credibility, as Mr. Manoj Joshi said, on both sides of the divide, both sides of the conflict. But the time should be ripe where both sides are willing to make some compromises. Right now, that time has not yet come. But if President Trump wins the White House in November, then the circumstances may change, the situation may change, the US view may change, and then India would be in a position to be in the group of countries which will try to bring some compromise to this conflict.
Mr. Joshi, in fact, what is your expectation from the ongoing G7 summit? Do you think it will be able to come out with certain outcomes to address pressing global challenges?
Well, Mr. Tayal has already brought out the fact that four of its leaders, if you include Germany also, the United States, UK, France, Germany, are in political trouble. They're in political trouble. So I don't expect, I think they will only agree to any kind of a formulation which will be narrow and focus on their interests. So I think things like migration and all, they may say something on Ukraine where they are all agreed. But beyond that, I do not expect that the summit will have any outcome which will be dramatic in any way. Because has been explained that these are people who are probably not even focusing. I mean, the President Biden is leaving on Friday evening itself. He's not even staying on for the next day of the summit. So in these kind of circumstances, I don't think that there will be anything dramatic. Maybe a narrow Europe focused thing on migration, on Mediterranean areas, and on Africa. You may have some formulations, but nothing beyond that.
Ambassador Tayal, Prime Minister Modi, again, I'll refer to his departure statement, talked about bringing greater synergy between the outcomes of G20 summit held in India's presidency and the forthcoming G7 summit. But to a broader point, do you think, in fact, there must be some coordination, there should be some discussions between G20 and G7 so that, in fact, both these groupings can work in tandem to address the challenges facing the world, including difficulties facing the global south?
I think it is not formal, but that will certainly be there because the Brazil President Lula is also in Italy. So certainly, as the present G20 and chairman, they will also have a role, and certainly the whole agenda and the wish list of the global south has already been prepared under India's leadership, because the whole year very intensive consultations were held with the global south countries, two summits, and after the G20 also. So all of that is there with a set of recommendations are already available in the public domain. Now it is for the leaders of the global south, and now G20 is also headed by South Brazil. So they should continue to push the G7 countries to accommodate the wishes, the demands, the requirements of global south, and no decision should be taken which hurts the economies of the global south. For instance, there is a move towards protectionism in many Western economies, but at present it is directed more against China, and rightly so, because China has industrial overcapacity, they have opaque system, they have all kinds of hidden subsidies, and they are trying to emasculate manufacturing in rest of the world, whether it is a developing country like India or emerging economy like India or the West. So that is fine. But under the garb of climate change or carbon emission or some hidden constraints should not be placed on the products of the global south. I think that is a message which should repeatedly go from the leaders of the global south to the G7 countries, that yes, you fight your protectionist battle against China, which is a real and present danger, but make sure that its fallout is not on the rest of the world, developing countries who are struggling to improve the living conditions of their population. So, in different ways, of course, Africa will be discussed and how Africa can be enabled. That is India's stand also. That instead of just going there and making projects like China does and putting them in debt trap, the effort should be for capacity building to enable Africa to help itself. That has been the approach of India all through in our assistance and our support and help to Africa. So there are many other agendas which need to be pushed and consistently pushed and energetically pushed, which I am sure Prime Minister Modi will do both in G7 as well as in his bilateral meetings.
Mr. Joshi, I'll again go back to Prime Minister Modi's meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. In the meeting, the Prime Minister also talked about the need for adopting a human-centric approach in finding a solution to the Ukraine conflict. How do you say it?
Well, human-centric approach basically means no war, that there should be no destruction, there should be no distress of people who are involved in the war, should take into account the concerns of their populations. So this human-centric basically means an approach towards promoting peace. And he said that it should be done through dialogue and diplomacy. I think this is a
Right.
fairly reasonable statement.
Right. And do you expect any end to the hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, as there have been multiple efforts to find some kind of solution and a halt to the
I'm quite
hostilities?
pessimistic on that. I think you will not find anything happening. And Mr. Tayal has pointed out that the real point to look out for that would be after the November election in the United States.
And Mr. Tayal, my last question would be, in fact, we have seen some kind of friction between various blocs and groups, like BRICS has been pushing for the global south, and there has been a feeling in like-minded groups comprising developing countries that the West is not heading to the difficulties being faced by global south. So, how do you see the geopolitics going forward? On the one hand, we have G7 and the rich countries, and on the other hand, we have countries of the global south. Do you see some kind of friction that we may expect in the future between these groups?
The global south, the north-south divide, the new international economic order. I joined service in 1976, and even before that, all these economic issues have been there. Some countries have made a lot of progress. China, East Asia, India has come up. So there has been a lot of cooperation also, but ultimately every country will protect its own national interest, the economic prosperity of its own population, and then in that framework try to help other countries to grow. So I will say that as far as the geo-economics, the economic issues are concerned, the world has been like this. There are issues, they keep changing, like energy. It became very major, now it has been contained. Tomorrow the issue may be water, the issue may be wheat shortage, grain shortage, climate change. So the issues keep changing, and this will be a constant struggle, constant battle, and short of war, this will be resolved or managed through dialogue, diplomacy, trade, investment, so that it is a win-win situation for most of the countries of the world. And this is happening, this will continue to happen. I'm not very pessimistic on that. But geopolitics, how far Ukraine will go, because it seems to be escalating. Every day there is some new measure, like the American weapons cannot be allowed to strike within Russia. So this seems to be escalating. So I am very pessimistic on that front.
And it will give India a greater space to play a much bigger role as a leader of global south, as well as to play a leading role in addressing various challenges.
Yes, but again, India has to keep on advising and giving good counsel, good advice, good suggestions. But the time for mediation in the Ukraine conflict has not yet come.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tayal. Thank you so much, Mr. Joshi, for a detailed perspective on G7, its overall approach, India's role in G7, as well as India's role in current scenario of global conflicts and instability. Thank you so very much.
You were listening to a discussion on India's strengthening relations with G7 countries. The participants were Skantharanjan Tayal, former ambassador, and Manoj Joshi, strategic analyst. The moderator was Manaspatim Bhuya, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.